Now, Mark isn't instituting the practice of communion or even explaining it as the Apostle Paul does in 1 Corinthians. Instead, Mark is showing us what Jesus does in an instance when many of us might have chosen something different and would have understood if he had. In between predicting his friend's betrayal and experiencing it, he has a meal with them. Judas, who sells him for 30 pieces of silver even after love's last appeal, Peter, who denies him not once but 3 times, James and John, who fall asleep instead of praying with him, all the rest who run away, Jesus knows what they will choose. Jesus knows what they will choose. He knows they will choose their own wills over God's, that they will choose self-preservation over sacrifice and courage, and he still chooses to eat with them. He still says, I trust you. I love you. I accept you. Jesus shares a Passover meal with his chosen family. More than that, Jesus shares a covenant meal, a renewal and a reminder of God's ancient promise to bless, and in so doing, he also points to the kingdom feast that awaits. Hundreds of years before Jesus, the prophet Isaiah spoke of the day of the Lord, the day when God would come and finally and fully make everything right. And this is what he says in Isaiah 25, "On this mountain the Lord of heavenly forces will prepare for all peoples a rich feast, a feast of choice wines, of select foods rich in flavor, of choice wines well refined. And he will swallow up on this mountain the veil that is veiling all peoples, the shroud enshrouding all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The Lord will wipe tears from every face. He will remove his people's disgrace, their shame from off of the whole earth. For the Lord has spoken, and they will say on that day, look, this is our God for whom we have waited, and he has saved us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let's be glad and rejoice in his salvation." This is what God longs to bring about. This is what God is bringing about. The metaphor is a feast, a kingdom feast. In theological circles, it's known as the messianic banquet, the party hosted by the Messiah. We talk about the flourishing of God's kingdom here, and by that we mean where every life and every sphere of life is thriving and whole because God is in charge there. And according to the Bible, this vision of the kingdom feast is where we're headed. Now, many of us don't really understand the cultural concept of feasting. I think it may be because we eat too much most of the time here in America. But in the Middle East in the first century, as it is in much of the world, most people live day to day, scrambling to get their daily bread. That's why they prayed for it. Maybe not even that. The image of a divine feast where food and drink are abundant and bountiful and quality would be such a glorious thing to look forward to. Right? Such a sign of God's provision, God's blessing, such a vision of hope. And so maybe in our current context, where we look around and we see gun violence and we see global conflict, maybe there that might be a vision of weapons of war and destruction and death being beaten into tools that bring life. That's in the prophet Micah. Maybe in our context of racial injustice, it might be a vision of people of all kinds in a just and righteous and holy peace with one another, restored and reconciled and worshiping the same Lord Jesus. That's in Revelation. Maybe in our context of busyness and stress and anxiety and fear, it might be a vision of rest and peace and refreshment. That's in the Psalms. The last meal Jesus shared with his disciples looked back at Passover, at God's liberating action in history, and it looked forward to the kingdom feast, God's final and full liberating action at the end of all of time. And every time we partake of communion, we mark God's liberating action through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. A gift to be received, not earned. In spite of us, not because of us. Communion is an invitation to life and love, to really live by really loving. Communion is an invitation to the way of Christ, in whom all things hold together. Communion is an invitation to the family meal. Whatever has happened, whatever will happen,